In our last video, we talked about supply and demand in terms of who's a supplier, who's a demander, and it depended upon which market we're talking about, the factors market or the product market. And so in either case, there's a seller supplying something, and there's a demander, there's a buyer demanding something. So no matter what market you're in, there's going to be a supplier and a demander. Let's talk about demand for a second. Now, don't think of demand as a measurement of sales. Think of demand as a measurement of intentions. In other words, how much do you intend to demand at different prices? So to think about this, the two key things here is the ability and willingness to demand something at different prices. So in other words, think of demand as a social club. And you have to satisfy two criteria to join this club. What's the two criteria? Well, you don't only need the willingness to buy something. You may love a particular automobile, but if you don't have the money to buy it, you don't have the ability, so you won't be part of the demand club. You need to have both the ability and willingness to demand a product at different prices. So in other words, we're simply trying to measure the reaction of people who have the ability and willingness to buy something. We're trying to measure their reaction to changing prices. Now, price is not the only thing that matters to people when they demand, when it comes to demand. In other words, price is just one particular determinant of demand. But it just so happens it's a very important one, and we're focusing on it. Or in other words, we're isolating what impact demand has on what impact price has on demand. Now we could look at price and its effect on supply. Now think about this. Think about a job that you would love to do, but you don't have the training or the ability to do it. Guess what? You're not part of labor supply. You have to satisfy both the ability and willingness to work a job at different wages. Now, think about producing a product. You need to want to produce it and have the ability to produce it, and we're going to measure how your supply changes at different price levels. In other words, we're gauging your reaction as a supplier to price, and that measurement is based upon your change in supply. So we're looking at your willingness and ability to supply something at different prices. Now, it just so happens the relationship when it comes to demand and price. So think about your consumer. When price goes up, your reaction, I don't know why that happened. When price goes up, your demand, we'll call this quantity demanded, tends to go down. And when price goes down, your quantity demanded tends to go up. We call this simple negative correlation, law of demand. In other words, law of demand simply states that price and demand are inversely related. Now, there's some exceptions to this. There's a type of good we call prestige goods. That's a good where when price goes up, quantity demanded goes up if people perceive it as a status symbol. The higher the price, the more exclusive it is. Maybe you can sell a few more yachts or a few more mink coats or something like that. But those are the exceptions. Most goods and services satisfy the law of demand here. Now, the supply works a little differently. Think about this. You're a producer. Let's call this quantity supplied. When price in here goes up, this is an incentive to supply more because it's more profitable to produce a good when you get more money for it. And the conversely, when price goes down, quantity supply goes down. Now look at the arrows. Notice how they're moving in the same direction. This has a positive relationship, and this is called the law of, you guessed it, supply. So again, these are just simple correlations. Law of demand, negative correlation. Law of supply, positive correlation. Now let's go to demand again, and let's look at the demand for a particular good by a particular person. Now, what we can do is I can go to, let's say I ask you for this particular product, let's call this, let's say a bottle of beer. Right? I say, okay, at $10, how much are you willing and able to demand? Well, at that price, I'll demand zero. No, I'm not going to buy anything. Well, what if I lower it to $9? How much? Well, I'll maybe buy one bottle. It better be some good beer, right? In other words, a demand schedule simply looks at different prices and simply logs your intention to demand at those prices. The demand curve simply graphs that data. So let me give you an example. On the left is a demand schedule. Notice how we have prices and quantity demanded. And we see at $50, you demand only one. Well, what if I lower price to $30? Well, now you demand seven. Notice how price went down and quantity demanded went up, right? And what if I say, what about 15? How much are you willing to demand? Well, at 15, I'll demand even more, 15, okay? And so you can see what we're doing here is we're simply logging this data. So let's go back to $50. You demand one. So if we put price on the vertical axis and demand on the horizontal axis, we see at $50, oops, let me get those arrows out of the way. I can't get those arrows out of the way. It's going to come back anyways. At $50, I demand one. See right here, that's one right there. Let me get rid of that. And at $30, I demand seven right here. And at $15, I demand 15 right there. And I connect those dots, and this is your demand curve. You notice how the slope of the demand curve is downward sloping, and that's because of the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Remember the law of demand? Price goes down, quantity demanded goes up, and vice versa. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes, oops, down. So again, like I said before, demand are not actual sales. Think of them as intentions. And the law of demand, we covered that. That's simply the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Now, like I said before, price is not the only thing that matters to consumers. There are other things that matter. Now, the book lists some generic determinants of demand. In other words, think about when you go to a restaurant, what do you care about other than the price of the meal? Well, you care about the quality of the service, the ambiance, the freshness of the food. In other words, all of those things are determinants of demand. The price on the menu is just one determinant. Now, the book lists some generic ones. For example, your tastes determine your level of demand. Your income. If you get a pay raise, you demand more of some goods and less of other goods. The availability of substitutes. When a new product comes online that's very similar to a product that you're consuming, but it's at a lower price, maybe that will affect your demand for that good. And of course, your expectations can have a big impact. The weather has an impact on your demand. In other words, there are many things that affect demand. What we're doing with supply and demand is we're isolating the effect price has on demand, and what we're doing is we're assuming these other things are held constant. In other words, they exist, they're just not changing. Therefore, any change in demand must be attributable to the change in price. Now, when we look at the demand curve, there are two ways we can change demand, and we have two terms for the way we change demand. One is called a change in quantity demanded. Another one is a change in overall demand. I think sometimes a textbook will refer to it as simply a change in demand. I prefer to include the change in overall demand because it's a little more descriptive. Just get my eraser here. So you can change demand by changing, that's the symbol, delta is a symbol for changing price. Or you can change demand by changing all of the other determinants. In other words, income, tastes, the weather. So what we do is if you change demand by changing price, we call that change in quantity demanded. If you change demand by changing another determinant and not changing price, we call it a change in overall demand. And it looks like this. Let's say you're at $39 and you have 5 in terms of demand. If I change price, we move along the demand curve, and that changes demand. So you can see demand is now 13. But what if I change income? What if I give the consumers more income? Well, that means if this is what we call a normal good is a good where you consume more of it if you have more income. That increases demand at all price levels, and that shifts the demand curve over this way, like so. And that's how we demonstrate a change in demand when you change a determinant other than price. You shift the demand curve. So when you change a frozen determinant, you shift the curve. When you change price, you move along the curve. Now, market demand is simply a summation of all of the individual demand curves. So you look at a classroom, look at the demand for a particular product from each student. If you add up all of their demand at a particular price, you're going to get a market demand curve. It's going to look like this. So we've got Tom's demand curve, George's demand curve, Lisa's demand curve. Now my demand curve is non-existent because maybe I don't like this product and I won't buy it at any price level. Well, if I add all of them up, let's say at a price 20, if I add up the demand at price 20, I could see that the market demand curve at price 20 is going to be a summation of all those individual demand. So supply works very much the same way. Market supply is the summation of all the individual supply curves. And supply is also affected by things other than price. Now, what do producers care about other than price? Well, think about this. Their factor costs are very important to them. When their factor cost changes, that changes their outlook on supply. Technology, when there's a technological breakthrough, that could impact supply. Competition, other goods impact supply. Taxes and subsidies, that can affect your decisions of what to produce and how much to produce. And expectations, as well as number of sellers. So in other words, these are just some generic determinants of supply other than price. What we're doing is we're holding these constant, and therefore if supply changes, it must be due to a change in price. Now, law of supply, that's simply the positive relationship. And market supply is the summation of all of the individual supply curves. You see here, it looks like just before. And Bob and Corey, add them together, and you get the market supply curve. Now, what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to put supply and demand together, and we're going to talk about how we could visualize allocative efficiency using supply and demand.